I'm having trouble with lifestyle design right now, and people are starting to notice. Namely, my family, because I'm living with them, and I'm feeling like I just don't have freedom of movement. So if I read something or write something and I feel energy to maybe create a video or something, I don't have the space and quiet in order to do that. There's a TV going on the other side of my wall, or there's people walking overhead, and I'm finding I'm really sensitive to all of that right now. And so it's a challenge, and I just feel partly like being away for so long and then coming back, I really just want to get into being able to create what I want to create, because I couldn't necessarily do that while I was away. And also, I did get to create what I wanted to create while I was away. I ended up coming off my meds. So to be back and then just sort of sit and vegetate isn't resonating with me. And I find it hard to read or think if there's a TV going on the other side of the wall. So I'm attempting to cohabit, but it's really challenging. And it's only temporary until I go back to the other place or whatever, but even for now, it's challenging. So it's making me ponder some things that I read about stoicism after watching a talk by Tim Ferriss. And there's a guy, I think his name's Jamie Holiday, and he wrote a book, or at least a chapter in a book called The Obstacle is the Way. Oh my gosh, it's a hummingbird. I don't know if you saw the hummingbird, but that was really exciting. So it feels like an obstacle in my living situation that's temporary, but it also is teaching me what I can live with and what I can't. So when I go to my next place, I have to keep in mind that I can't necessarily live in a hollow apartment building where there's going to be TV noises on every wall. And I'm just feeling more comfortable in general in nature. In California, it was just full of nature and beauty, and I had a small space for my personal space of living, but when I went outdoors, it was just like being in a park. It was like living in a small room in a park. Whereas living in a small room in a basement of a house is feeling quite stifling. In a way, it's good because I will get out of the house, and that's a good thing to do while the weather's still nice, because it's going to get really, really rainy and cold within a relatively short period of time. So in terms of the obstacle is the way, I'm seeing my living situation as an obstacle, but it's also allowing me to question how to design my life moving forward. And even something as simple as getting that battery pack is really helpful. So that helps with being able to be out and about and mobile. So it feels good to keep moving. And perhaps part of what feels stifling is that I can't just talk to myself when I want to, because there are people around. And they don't know that part of it. I didn't say that I talk to myself on video, so I need quiet, and I need to be able to think, and I need space. And this leaf is really cute. So I am feeling the pressure of my living situation, and I may have to find a new place. I didn't go back to the noisy place, but I still could. And I could also just find a different place, which I will at some point. I just wanted to see if I could settle in first before having to do that. And this isn't even my PMS week, and I'm already starting to feel the pressure building up. And I have come across some interesting articles and things on creativity lately that really sparked me into writing stuff. And I want to extrapolate some of it, but I just don't really have the space to do so. And then the next day I'll listen to something else, and then I'll get inspired again, but then I don't have the space to do something with that. So then I start to feel disorganized. There's a woodpecker or something. So it seems like being able to be in dialogue with myself is really important, because that is a big reason why I feel stressed, is not being able to have dialogue with myself when I am inspired to do so. And then I have to change my behavior, as in not have dialogue with myself, because I can't at that moment. And then I do something else, and it sort of dissipates the energy, and also makes the energy feel like it's building up and not getting transformed. It's kind of like still channeling that information and meaning and perception from the universe, and then not being able to utilize the process that I have this past year in order to move that energy. But then I feel some kind of guilt in a way, because I'm more connected to that process than I am to the people around me sometimes. But that's not true. I'm connected to people, but I don't need to be around people all the time. I would rather be able to control when I see people and when I don't, instead of always living around people. So, as usual, it's a continual learning process. My nervous system might be extra sensitive because I was in a place so quiet and pristine and beautiful for so long, and now coming back, this situation feels more intolerable than perhaps it could. And I feel kind of like a bitch in a way, because I can't stand being around people, and it's not necessarily them, it's just the way I am, I guess. I feel like I can sit in a park and do nothing. But if I'm in a house and I'm just sitting there, not able to move in a way because there's so much noise and things going on around me, I'm not okay with that. And in California, I really connected to nature, so I feel like I almost became more nature. More of my being is just nature. And that's part of being human too. But a lot of times that is de-emphasized in society. But now nature is a really strong part of my nervous system and being, so not being in nature as much is a challenge. Yeah, I really don't know. I'm trying to figure this out. I don't want to go downhill, and I don't want to end up seeming really unwell to people. And I was fearing this, and I was hoping I could just come back and be fine and everything would be smooth sailing, but it's not turning out that way. It's turning out not worst case scenario, but a pretty bad case scenario where they're noticing that I'm not doing well in that situation. I've still been using the Muse headset, and I do like it, actually. I usually sit quietly before I go to bed, because that way, after I take the 6 amino acids of hearty nutritionals, I can allow it to go into my stomach a little bit before laying down, because otherwise it can have a tendency to come back up and get stuck in my throat and gargle around, and it's not very pleasant. So now I've just been putting the headset on while I sit quietly, and that time of night is quiet, so I'm able to just be quiet and sit quietly. And I did a 12-minute meditation for the first time, and it asks you to pay attention to your breathing. And this time I was paying attention to my belly breath for the first while, but I really found myself trying to pay attention to what would get more birds, which is the time when the brain has been calm for a little while. So the first 6 minutes, I was able to get 3 birds, and then the last 6 minutes, I actually got 16 birds. And I noticed the difference was actually paying attention to my breath through my nose as opposed to my belly, because the instructions say pay attention to your breath somewhere, wherever is most comfortable. So I just assumed, oh, my belly's a good place. But this time I actually was paying attention to my breath in different spots on my body, until I noticed that paying attention to my breath through my nose actually created a lot of calmness in birds. And I also had 12 recoveries in the first 6 minutes, which means my brain went into the active zone. So recovery is good in a way, because I was able to go back down out of the active zone into neutral or calm. But it's also not good, because that means my brain went into the active state. And so the first 6 minutes I had 12 recoveries, and the last 6 minutes I had 6. So I was definitely a lot calmer in the last 6 minutes. And I will show those graphs. So paying attention to a certain place on my breathing can change the calmness. And I also realized that it's not necessarily going to stay the same each time, because I did the whole paying attention to my nose breathing last night, and it didn't really have the exact same results. It seems, though, that I've gotten to a place with that headband where I really am paying attention to and monitoring my inner space and seeing how that changes the feedback from the sound of the app. And I guess that's the point of it. So discovering that, and maybe finding different ways to pay attention to the inner that will bring more calmness. Because my brain is pretty calm in general, but I do feel it's also very active in general, even though it is calm. It's quite active. And I think that goes along with this seeming proclivity to have access to more information, or however that works. And I mentioned I came across some interesting articles lately, really interesting, and usually when I read stuff and I find it fascinating, it seems that that's already something that I'm looking into or actually doing already. And somebody that I came across by watching a video that was just on my YouTube main page as a recommendation was by a man named Bo Lotto, and he's a neuroscientist. And I watched that talk, and then I ended up watching 2 other talks by him, and it was really interesting because what he's talking about to me is at least partly exactly what I'm doing. He was talking about creativity, and I'm going to go into it more because I feel it's really important. But he was saying the basis of creativity is perception. And I've talked to myself at great length about perception and insight and how it's different than just. And I'd want to stop saying the word just. Somebody pointed that out to me, not to point it out, but then I noticed that I say just a lot, and I say really and actually, and some of these qualifier type words that aren't really necessary, because I was listening to a video from November that I made on some business ideas just to see what the heck I was talking about, because I don't remember. And I noticed there are certain words that I say a lot, and it's partly because, and I said partly too, because the thing is, it's not totally, it's partly. I don't want to say anything that sounds like it's only that. And Robert Anton Wilson might call that maybe logic. These are sort of maybe logic words, I think. So they're not necessarily bad, but I do notice that I use them because I'm not talking in absolutes to myself. So even wanting to say, I use those words partly because I don't want to sound like I'm speaking in absolutes to myself. I don't necessarily need the word partly. I could say I blah 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 because, not partly because. So I do use these maybe logic type words, and I'm just making that up now, and maybe that will explain to myself why I say some of those words all the time. But there are some that sound a little bit more concrete, like actually and really, and I don't know about using those, and I hope I didn't use those so much all the way along, but I likely did. Because I do talk to myself about language creation, and some of it is just editing out some of those words, as well as creating words, and I haven't even learned how to integrate some of the words that I've created for myself into talking with myself, but at least I have created words with myself. And I even started creating a little bit of a lexicon of sorts, which is just the alphabet down and then all the words that start with that letter across, which might be kind of interesting. And I totally diverged from what I was about to say about Bo Lotto, and I do find what he says really fascinating. It's right on the mark with what I've been talking with myself about all this time. And he said creativity starts with perception, and to me, this whole process of self-dialogue has been an activity in perceiving creatively and talking about it. there's so many things that he said that are very relevant to what I've been doing, and I will go into it later, but I did write down a quote that he said. Bo Lotto said, "The next greatest innovation is not going to be an external technology, but an internal way of seeing and doing." And for me, this whole self-dialogue has been my way of seeing and doing, of seeing for myself, discovering for myself. And he even used the phrase creating perception. So perception isn't a passive thing. It's not reporting accurately on what is out there, but there are other elements that come in to create our perception, and usually that is the past. And he talks about that. He talks about how the past is part of what comes in to create our perceptions, and creativity is seeing differently. So he actually says creativity is seeing differently. And I've talked to myself for hours on all the ways that I see differently, especially related to mental health. And so that is the definition of creativity according to him. And so to me, this whole process of self-dialogue is creativity itself. It's seeing differently, and it's a process of capturing what I see differently by saying it to myself on video. And he talked about how if it's our past stuff that comes in order to create perception, and that's old, and we would rather be resting in what we know than what we don't know, meaning we crave certainty. So we'd rather cling on to past certainty and insert that into the present moment than be uncertain or not know. So all of our accumulated memory and experience is the known, and we cling on to that and add that into our perceptions, and so we're not able to see differently, so we're not able to be creative. So we'd rather be certain than creative. And I don't think he said it that way, but it sounds like we'd rather be certain than creative. And it can even make it sound like creativity is this big thing, like this big mystery that you have to sit down and practice, but the simplest perception can be a creative act if we approach the moment with not knowing. And I've said this to myself many times, is that the most important thing that I could ever say to myself in a way is I don't know. Because when I don't know something, then it leaves open the possibility of seeing something new. So what is cool about this guy's work is that what he's talking about is what I've been doing all along. And he's actually giving the neuroscience to back it up. And he also talks about anyone can be a scientist. I've talked about that. I've talked about being a guyentist. And he talks about several things that I've talked about all along the way, including how important it is to discover things for ourselves. So he has a website, bolotto.com, and there's a section on there called Labs, and I want to talk about it more later, but he mentions he has this lab where it's an experiential type workshop, but it's not really a workshop, where you actually discover things for yourself, not just passively get information. Because he's saying discovering for ourselves is what's most important, and that is one of the fundamental things that I've come upon in this process, is that self-discovery is the most important thing. And it doesn't really matter what you discover, and it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, it's the discovery. And the discovery is self-evident, and it doesn't necessarily have to be shared. We can't necessarily share everything we discover. But what we can do is move into that way of being that is discovering for oneself. And that's something that I've done with myself. And by being in that mindset or mind frame of self-discovery, I've been able to discover things in daily life as well. It's not just talk. It has been an embodied thing all along too. By creating all that context around mental health, I was able to move out of the mental health system. And that was another thing he talked about in one of his talks, was that context is everything. He was saying that information really has no meaning. We actually give the meaning, or the brain gives the meaning to the information. It's not a passive process. So in this process, I've talked to myself a lot about how important it is to make one's own meaning, which is to make one's own context. And this whole time, I've just been creating context for myself. Not, this is step 1, step 2, step 3. That's just information to go by as a pattern, which he talked about. He said that we give kids recipes. Kids going through education is just giving them a bunch of recipes for life. But by doing that, they're not taught this self-discovery or discovering for oneself, which is the most important thing. It's not what you discover, but that you discover, that you can discover for yourself. And I read a great quote in a book by Krishnamurti called Individual and Society. On one of the first pages, it says that very thing. And he also said, don't cling on to what you discover. And then it just becomes this endless flow of discovery. Not to discover a particular thing. And that's what science is, in a way. It's trying to discover particular things that are very utilitarian and useful. And then the masses just sort of walk around waiting for those discoveries to come out, but they're along a certain direction. So the information on his website and his videos is very interesting, because it's exactly what I've been doing with myself, and it definitely works to discover for oneself. And he talks about how uncertainty is necessary for creativity. And to me, the whole thought structure of our personal ego self is our security and our known that prevents creative perception. Perception itself is a creative act, but when we are always injecting that with past, it's not really a creative act. It's just recreating the past. And so the self-dialogue has been talking about creative perceptions, bringing other context and meaning into the moment of what I see. And this, in a way, is a selfless operating system, because the self is all that we know about ourselves, all our ideas, our beliefs, our thoughts, everything that we know about ourselves in a bundle. So when we're not bringing that into the moment, if we're not associating everything we see with ourself and fear and pleasure, moving towards or moving away, then something else can come in order to create perception. So fear in terms of reward and punishment and is what's in the way, and he talked about that too. So yeah, lots of parallels. The difference is that I've discovered this for myself along the way, and now it seems whenever I reach out to see what other people are doing, I see they're talking about exactly what I'm doing and have been doing with myself by self-dialogue. And self-dialogue just means I'm talking to myself, my being, and I created new words around myself as well. So I don't even really like the word self. I could just call it creative dialogue, because it's talking about creative perceptions, not just thoughts about the self. I don't know. This isn't about some separate creativity. We are that creative energy in the most powerful embodied form in the universe. I learned about the term neuro-Buddhist and neuro-Humean for David Hume. So I want to create the term neuromanian. I just edited my last video and I seem kind of out of it. I seem a little bit low. I don't necessarily feel quote unquote depressed, but I can see there's a difference in my demeanor for sure. So I want to see if I can improve that somehow, or feel somewhat more free than I actually feel. And so I'm thinking of just making a video of insights, random insights from what I've written down, to see how that makes me feel. Insight number 1. The problem is the way of looking that asks people for ready-made answers. We who go into map consciousness have interiors full of energy that is not yet manifest. Bring that out as that increases consciousness of humanity. It doesn't matter what understanding you unfold. The point is to unfold meaning, not particular meaning. The ego is the conglomeration of the particular meanings we've been given to identify with. Matter is how consciousness transforms itself, and life is the algorithm. Put your visions into play in your life. Think differently. Allow some energy to think you. See differently. Allow some energy to see through you. So I got bored of that idea of saying random insights pretty quickly. So I've been sitting here pondering how to approach all of this. My current living situation, having these notebooks full of insights that I'm attaching some importance to, not having the space to really do the same process of self-dialogue in order to unfold some of them, wondering if they really are that important, wondering about action as opposed to words. And the main goal I had was to talk myself out of the mental health system, and I did that. So is it time to switch gears? And I've talked about this several times with myself, but then I usually end up going back to feeling like I need to continue with the self-dialogue. And maybe I do to some extent, but it's possible that it needs to atrophy. And I'm realizing this too, because I'm not connecting as much with my family because I have this urge for self-dialogue. So I came up with some thoughts to type up my notes, which doesn't really require personal space the way self-dialogue does, and also possibly writing a book, or I'm not sure, but I'm feeling like maybe these last 20 videos or so I will talk myself out of self-dialogue and move into action. And I have talked about this to myself, but I'm seeing that there are a lot of insights, and it would be a lot of time and energy to try to catch up. And maybe it's not necessary. Maybe it's a lot of repetition. And I was also thinking about, if I create a business, then at least maybe that way I'll learn to create a business instead of just creating self-dialogue. So I was thinking about continuing the self-dialogue until September 11th, but not really worrying about what I'm going to talk about in particular in terms of the insights. And then perhaps typing up insights over time, or going through it and seeing if there is anything that I do really want to talk about, but not making that the primary emphasis. Now, I'm not sure if the wind blowing like that is agreement, or I think it is agreement. It was a strong wind reaction from the universe. So I came up with a couple possible business names, and that's sort of the step that I'm hung up on, is the name of the business, which is kind of silly considering I'm really used to creating a lot of different words, and context is just difficult to narrow it down into one word. So I might get some advice from a friend or two and then just do it, because I think the naming process is like $30 to $50. And if I screw that up and I have to submit a different name, then oh well. It's just part of it. And maybe self-dialogue would become interesting again if it was something that was moving alongside of creating something, like business or something. I don't know what. And I really like the word synchronicity, but it's probably taken for a business, so I created a word out of the word synchronicity. I created the word synchroversity, which is something to do with a discovery learning community for visions, special messages, and synchronicity, creativity, learning. I already said learning. Because I want to move into creativity, and then I wrote down that synchroversity is a place. It has verse in it, like universe. It has city in it, kind of like university, but also like city, and synchro as part of synchronicity. And I realized that the word chronicity is in synchronicity. And syn, S-Y-N, stands for without. So synchronicity is without chronicity. So that's another reason I kind of liked the synchronicity word, is because that is what my main focus in life is, in a way, is moving away from the chronicity associated with labels of mental illness. So synchronicity without chronicity, and then synchronicity being that really cool experience of connecting meaning, seeing meaning and moving in the field of, in a way, adding something creatively meaningful to a perception in order to create an excuse to move towards it and look further into it and be curious about it. So it's the curiosity, it's the wonder, it's moving in that field as opposed to the known and the past and the self. And synchroversity has the word verse in it, like a song, and it has ver, and it has ver, which is the Spanish verb to see, and I'm all about seeing and perception. And it also sounds something like it could be related to self-dialogue. A synchroverse could be one's universe synchronizing with one's own meaning and one's own voice, creating your own universe of context. And a universe, a you and I verse, is kind of like a dialogue. It's a verse, and verse is also converse, so it's to do with talking. So I kind of like this word because it sounds like what it's supposed to be, all put into one, and sounds sort of like university, like a learning community. Synchronize with your unique voice. And there's a couple more things I want to say. If somebody would just turn off their GD motorcycle. Okay, they heard me. And synchronicity also makes it sound like it's not just about one person, but it's sort of a community, a city. And yeah, another thing I wanted to talk to myself about is how, now that I've talked myself out of the mental health system, I feel like it's possibly important to not continue to utilize the process I use to move away from the mental health system as much, because the point was to be able to be more in touch with life and live life, not just sit and talk about insights about life. And I could change my mind tomorrow, but that's how I feel right now. I was just trying to think of the word that I created, which was dia-improvalog, which was more related to being in action in life. So I need to move from dialogue to dia-improvalog. And part of the dia-improvalog is creating a business and just pretending and going along with it and learning as I go. And the other thing I was thinking about synchronicity was one has to follow the synchronicity in order to live in the world of synchronicity. So it would be a practice of following synchronicity as opposed to ready-made plans. So this next part could actually be an exercise in synchronicity and then creating something around that in a creative way for creativity. So living creatively and then also having a business to back it up. And the self-dialogue would have been the process I used to get to the point where I'm able to live in that way. And the last thing I want to say that I was thinking about in terms of this company, since I don't know what I'm doing, this self-dialogue in a way is a lot of what I have as ideas that I can't create by myself. And the wind is really blowing again, so I think it likes this idea that it's really an invitation for co-creators and collaborators from whatever I talked about, because I can't remember anything. So it'd be nice if people just came up to me and said, you said this and you wanted to create this, remember? I'm here to participate in some way. And go from there, because I don't know anything. My memory is my dialogue on my phone with myself, and it's not in my brain at all. So just putting it out there, to me, this feels like maybe this whole time I was talking to myself in order to just invite co-creators, and also co-creating the path to having a clear nervous system, and also creating something where I could invite co-creators. So yeah, this is an invitation to co-create in some way and co-create this business, because I know nothing about business. And being in the business of unfolding meaning and learning and creating and synchronicity and all the things I've said to myself along the way that I just can't remember. So I created a word called C-minder and me-minder. And I think I'll create one called we-minder, which is other people reminding me instead of me trying to have to remind myself. So I could watch these videos to try to remind myself, or I could just put it out there and ask for we-minders and co-creators and people who resonate with some of these weems and who have been in these states themselves. So that's the invitation, and maybe I'll unfold that more in the next videos, because I do think that I will go for 400 in the year period which is September 11th, and then go from there. I'm learning a lot about myself lately regarding being back home and what bothers me and what doesn't. And it seems like something that really bothers me is TV noise and iPad noise. And there weren't any TVs around when I was in California, so I didn't really notice that it was bothersome because it wasn't around. But now that it's around, it's really bothering me. And so I feel like people are trying to be more quiet and not have the TV on. And so the TV sound was off last night, and I felt fine, and I was just working away, and I got a lot done. I was reading through some of my notes and typing them up, and I was also downloading some of the YouTube videos as audio to make the audio video playlist with YouTube MP3 program and also Tunes to Tube web-based browser thingamajiggy. So I did that for the last month of videos, and yeah, I was doing a bunch of things at once and I felt totally fine. But if I'm sitting in my room and the TV's on, I just can't even do anything. It feels like I can't even move. So I'm learning that. And then I had an experience with the Muse headset that sort of confirms that. I did a meditation and I realized that I think the sounds of the Muse app are quite distracting for me. So I tried using the Muse headband as well as the app, but I just turned the volume all the way down, so I couldn't really hear anything. And I actually earned a lot more birds and had way less recoveries because I had way less times going into an active brain state. And I can't even remember the numbers right now, but I will check. I had 35 birds and 10 recoveries last night in 10 minutes, and I think I had something like 58% calm time, whereas before I was around 48 or something. So yeah, not listening to the sounds made it a lot easier to stay calm and not have the sound of the bird be distracting. And I don't know if I'm supposed to get to a point where I'm not distracted by the sound of the birds, but I feel it's better just to use the headset and not have those bird sounds. And so I passed level 6, which was to have 4 sessions in 2 days. And level 7's challenge is to get 2,000 points. So, before that, I did another meditation this morning to get the 4 times in 2 days thing. And I got 37 birds and 12 recoveries or something. And I also didn't have the volume going for that. So it seems like it's better just to stay calm and not have the sounds. But that sort of gets rid of the biofeedback aspect of it. But I feel like the biofeedback is what is distracting. And maybe one cannot be so distracted by that and can stay focused on breathing, but I'm not sure. So then this morning I went to the park and I thought for my level 7 challenge I'm supposed to get 2,000 calm points. So I figured if I do 17 minutes at the park I should probably be able to get that. But it didn't turn out that way. I didn't get that many points. I think I got around 1,500, and I had more time in the neutral zone and quite a few more recoveries and not as many birds. So The park was actually a little distracting because it was windy. So there was the rustling of the leaves of the tree, and there were a couple of people that walked by, and there were actual birds chirping. So I was thinking how it's interesting that one can be distracted by actual birds. And I don't think it's really distraction, because one can be distracted by a stimulus like a TV, or one can be so-called distracted by a bird. I don't think that that's really a distraction. If I'm sitting there breathing quietly and I hear a bird, I think I want to hear the actual bird in reality, but I don't actually want to hear a TV going. So I became aware of the difference between a sound that's distracting, like even the sounds of the Muse app with the fake bird, or a real bird at the park. And I think I want to hear the real bird at the park. So that was actually interesting to note, that a lot of times moving through the world, we are bombarded by stimuli that we would want to tune out and maybe stay connected to our breathing and our body, but we don't want to be like that all the time. And I feel like if the world was more designed for highly sensitive people and not so much noise, and there were more trees and nature and birds around, I don't think it would really be a problem as much to be distracted. I don't even think it would be distraction. When I was in California, it was just nature and beauty, and I didn't have to worry about being distracted by nature. So distraction is, in my mind, a false construct. But I'm noticing, being back, that there are things that really do bother me. And I noticed last night as I was falling asleep that my boobs were hurting again. So I feel like I'm getting this 2-week long PMS. And that could be contributing too. I feel like the Hardy Nutritionals are working right now to heal some of my hormone stuff. That's just an intuition. I don't know if it's true. But it feels like I spend half the month in a more emotional and sensitive state than the other half, and that vacillates day by day and varies day by day as well. But I'm just noticing that the signs of PMS are there sort of halfway through the month. Tonight I'm going to go for the 2,000 calm points on Muse. I don't know if it's actually helping. I'm still just going along with it, and I'm not really trying to do it to get help. I just find it fascinating. And it is facilitating some form of learning, because seeing that the sounds of the app are distracting, and then sound in general is something that will make the brain active. And there's certain sounds that are fine, like the rustling of the leaves in a park, and there are other sounds like the murmuring of the TV through the wall that I just can't deal with. It messes up my brain. It really feels like it does, at least. And the Muse app and Muse headband helped me discover that to some extent. So that is cool. And I've been working on some of the ideas for the business, as well as some of the extrapolations from the cool things that I've read lately. And I do want to get into those before I get into anything that I've extrapolated. And I was typing up my notes, and I got through quite a bit. And there was some seemingly interesting stuff there that maybe I'll want to get to at some point. But I feel like I'm going to extrapolate some of these things I read, and then probably not really worry about getting into the stuff that I'm typing up, and just continue to type some of it up. First, I want to talk about some stuff that I read on bolotto.com/about. So it's Bo Lotto, the neuroscientist's about page. And he has a section that you can click on titled Labs or Workshops. And what he describes is really fascinating because, well, it just is. He says, for example, that experience, both personal and shared, shapes your brain, literally. So I extrapolate that to an experience in so-called mania, or map consciousness or trance consciousness shapes the brain. It can't do but otherwise. And this whole dialogue with myself this past year, I've been interested in how it shapes the brain. And in a way, that first experience in map consciousness 6 years ago is what is shaping this very conversation with myself. It's the reason why I'm having this conversation with myself. So it's literally changed my whole life and created this unfolding of dialogue and context creation with myself that I wouldn't have otherwise had fuel to do. And he says, since the structure of your brain determines what you see, it's never possible to see the information in front of you directly, which has no inherent meaning anyway. So we never see what information is directly in front of us. And he goes on to say that you only ever see the past behavioral significance or meaning of that information. So he's saying we see the meaning of the information in front of us. So to me, map consciousness changes the meaning of what we see in front of us, because it's no longer only information from past behavioral significance, but there's some other energy adding new significance into the information and presenting it to us as our perception. And having an experience in map consciousness also changes the brain in ways that will make seeing in these new ways possible again. So he says, in other words, we only see what was useful to see before. And he goes on to say, but if what I see now is a response grounded in the past, how can I ever see differently in the future? So that's a very complicated question. And it's complicated in terms of extrapolating it to my own personal context. And that's what I want to do, is adapt what he's saying to my own personal context. And he says this himself later on in his blurb under the lab section. He says, my aim is to transform our understanding of change through discovery. It's only through discovery that we embody the understanding that leads to resilience, i.e., the ability to share and adapt knowledge to your own social and personal context. And to me, that's just brilliant, because that's what my conversation with myself has been all about this past year, is taking my experience and knowledge and information and meaning making and everything and adapting it to my own personal context. And that's what I'll continue to do. And what I've found through time is that by this process of self-discovery, which he just said, it's only through discovery that we embody the understanding that leads to resilience. So this process of self-dialogue for me has been about my own discoveries, and I've talked about this whole time in that way, discovering for myself, and then here, a year later, I find somebody who's a neuroscientist who's saying that this is actually neurophysiologically and neuroplastically coherent. And what I'm also finding is through my own discoveries, when I figure something out or I discover something for myself through self-dialogue, then when I go look around in reality, in actuality, it then confirms my discovery. So it's a reversal of the process of discovery from what we usually think in terms of what learning is. And we usually feel like by looking outward we'll find the answers, but it happens differently when we start discovering by unfolding meaning and context for ourselves. Then when we go to reach out to reality, we find in reality what we've discovered. And this is how it already works in a way. It's the ego with its ruminating loops going on repeat, and then that confirms that reality is the way it is because it's repeating, and that creates perception and joins with the information that we're perceiving to confirm that the world is the way that the ego voice is telling us it is. But when we go into that state of wonder and discovery, and we really don't know how it is, then when we do discover something and then we look out, we'll find something that confirms that that is true for the moment, at least. It's not necessarily absolutely true, but it's how the universe responds to our discoveries by then presenting that as possible. So a discovery is, this is a possibility, and then it's there in actuality. So I would extend what he's talking about, because he's saying it's this process of discovery that we embody, because he's saying that through this process of discovery we embody the understanding and it leads to resilience. But I would say it also leads to manifestation and creation of our life in actuality. To say that discovery, which is something beyond the personal self, we have to see beyond what the ego is telling us to discover something new. So it's something beyond our self-construct. So then to say that just builds resilience, which is something attributed to the self, is limited in my mind, because it actually builds the ability to discover what we discovered in the unfolding of our life. Because the ego is that which would cover up what might unfold in our life if we might discover something new. So I don't know if that makes any sense, and that was kind of jumping ahead, but I just wanted to bring that in because I'm reading some of what he has written and then adapting it to my own personal context. And I've already discovered these points for myself, and I'm just pointing it out that I've been yabbing to myself for a year and discovering these certain aspects of life or being or whatever the heck. And then here is a neuroscientist saying the exact same thing that he has probably discovered through his science process. I've discovered it through my Gaians process, the Gaiantist in me, in investigating my being's relationship to daily life through my experience. And now it seems I'm at the point where I'm trying to reach out and figure out these things in daily life through lifestyle design. So how do I design a life of discovery and not have a life of self-protection or creating resilience out of discovery? And resilience is part of it, but resilience for what? To continue to discover, to continue to manifest, to continue to create, to continue to unfold. And then he goes on to talk about how we're really afraid of uncertainty. And if anyone has gone into so-called mania or map consciousness, then you would have that sense that in that state, we're not afraid of uncertainty at all. We're moving in the field of uncertainty, and that's why it's so creative. And he's saying that we need to start with not knowing and uncertainty in order to be creative. I think I heard that from one of his talks, so I won't go into that now. And he says, thus certainty is a deep survival need, and uncertainty the cause of most contemporary social and emotional pathologies, which means the next greatest innovation is not going to be an external technology, but an internal way of seeing and doing. In short, fear, not efficiency, is the biggest barrier to success. And I shared that quote in a previous video because it's so important. And I wonder, from what he said there, is there a way to live in uncertainty? And I would say that's living in that state of mania. And I'm not trying to glorify it or say it's the be-all end-all. What I'm saying is, can we extract and extrapolate some of those qualities and turn those qualities of that state into a kind of skill? Can we be skillful? And it's important to balance taking care of the body with that creative energy. And he says, changes that leads to innovation, leadership, and learning all require letting go of certainty. So it's interesting. He's saying let go of certainty, yet those of us who've been in mania know that it's a lot to do with letting go of certainty. And it's not that we choose to let go of certainty. Certainty lets go of us. And so here's another case of somebody who is creating research from the perspective of there's something that needs to let go, or there's something that we can volitionally do, and all of our volition is from certainty. It's from a place of knowing, and any act we do from that place will only move us in the field of the known, because it's a projection from the past. So how can a projection from the past move into uncertainty? So what I'm saying is there's a whole neurotribe of people that go into certainty because that certainty lets go of us, not that we let go of it. And I'm wondering if we can let go of it. And maybe we can, but I'm curious about the tribe of people who don't try to let go of anything and are thrust into uncertainty. So it's the same theme where there are those who are trying to get into flow, trying to get into these other states, and then there's people who go into the states without this volitional act, and then as soon as it happens without a volitional act, or a supposed volitional act, and it happens in a megadose through non-volition versus a microdose versus some kind of contrived pattern of volition, then it's a pathology. So I don't know about that, and that's why I'm taking this other perspective of knowing that I've gone into these non-volitional, uncertain states and wondering what I can harvest and put into my daily life to embody that, because I've had an immersive experience in this uncertainty. And he did say in one of his videos that the brain only moves in short jumps, and I don't know if that's true. And he said that even when someone appears to make a big jump, it's only from the outside perspective, because internally it's the next logical step for that person that appears to be being so creative. So I feel like in him saying that the algorithm of map consciousness is creativity that makes the next logical step a creative step, as opposed to a very limited step that the ego might take. So it changes the algorithm to make far-reaching ideas seem obviously linked. So yeah, continuing to do what he's saying to do in his little blurb here, and moving this information and making it meaningful in terms of my own personal context. And he says, thus, understanding the relationship between uncertainty, experience, and brain plasticity in creating perception is essential to understanding the principles of behavioral change and why change is so difficult. So here he's saying something about the necessity of behavioral change, or why it's difficult to change. Yet again, if somebody has a huge behavioral change because they've gone into a map conscious state, then everyone's concerned. So it's okay to have these little 30-day challenges where you have one little behavior change, but if there's a radical mutation in the mind where someone is all of a sudden radically different in behavior, then everyone is wondering, what's wrong with that person? What's wrong with that ego? What's wrong with that self? And something I want to talk about next is an article about how there is no self. It's a model of the world. So an algorithm changes to change how we model the world, and then our behavior changes accordingly. And he says here, understanding the relationship between uncertainty, experience, and brain plasticity in creating perception is essential to understanding the principles of behavioral change. Well, there's principles of the Manic algorithm. And the Manic algorithm is all about being in uncertainty. It's about not even taking the law of gravity and the laws of physics for granted. It's really starting from scratch and moving in that field of uncertainty. And in that way, all the knowledge we've accumulated and identified with and attached to ourselves as what we know as an ego self, storing up that information in memory to use for later. And that's what we use to create our perception. He says, creating perception. So usually we have the past knowledge coming in to create perception. But when we're in this field of uncertainty, we don't have all that past knowledge to come in to create perception. So something else, some other energy infuses the information with different meaning. So the smallest perception can feel very meaningful because there's a brand new, fresh meaning. And this is important because each moment we're creating our perception, and we're probably most likely creating it with our ego knowledge. So nothing seems fresh and new. And the ego knowledge that would be infused into the moment is old. And if that process ceases, then each moment we have access to infinite possibilities of what to even look at, let alone the meaning that can be infused to what we end up looking at in that moment. So all of a sudden we're in this field of something totally rich and new, because every single thing that we look at and explore is infused with a creative energy that is presenting us with all this meaning. So we're away from this meaningless knowledge structure of something very limited into unlimited possibilities. And today when I was walking, I kind of realized that. This whole year, I've been playing with perception, playing with creating perception. I've had insights where I see something, and when I see and I look, the knowledge of myself or my brain accumulation doesn't come in, but something else whispers a different possible meaning. And I write it down, and that's an insight. And it's not about right and wrong, which can only come into play if we're comparing to our past knowledge. So if we're not comparing to our past knowledge, which is an accumulation of right and wrong, good and bad, reward and punishment, pleasure, pain, then we're listening to this voice of insight, and then we can write them down or speak as that, instead of speaking as the knowledge of the ego that it would infuse into the moment and just make us continually live out past perceptions. We're creating old perceptions over and over. So the relationship between uncertainty, experience, and brain plasticity. So map consciousness is an experience of uncertainty, hence brain plasticity. Those are all tied together, and that's part of learning. So learning something new every moment. And we don't even know what that thing will be because it's so infinite. It's not a thing. It's sensing the meaning of something by just looking at it. So this, what he's talking about, applies to all of what I've talked about with myself regarding learning. So can we let the moment talk to us? Can we let the moment of what we look at arise spontaneously with a new infusion of meaning, as opposed to the known coming in and saying that it's already seen that before. In each moment there's infinite bits of what we've never seen before, and there's a very small amount of what we have already seen before. But when we're always bringing in our knowledge bank, we're moving in a very limited field of creating perception. So I wonder if we can design certainty in the areas that are necessary and then move in that field of uncertainty. So it's no wonder that when we're in this uncertain field, experiencing all this neuroplasticity, that our behaviors change so much. So to me, this sounds like epigenetics at the level of the brain cells, at the level of the moment. And Bo says, without this awareness, the ability to innovate, lead, and learn will be limited, since at the core of these most essential and creative human behaviors is the ability to see differently, to live with intention. So it's interesting that he says the most essential creative human behavior is the ability to see differently. And when we go into map consciousness, we see everything differently. We see everything new. We see things different than other people do. We see more than other people do. We say what we see. And we're trying to share that perception. We're trying to share that creative perception. So we have a creative perception, we share it, and it's met with people not necessarily seeing what we're saying because they're translating it according to their past memory bank. So something that is actually important is to realize that that's what other people are doing. Because one of the downfalls is, in a way, when that happens and we're in that creative perceptual state, we feel like everyone else is there too, but they're not per se. So we need to be careful how we share those creative perceptions. So we need to be aware what universe we're in and what universe other people are in. And just because we're in a different realm, in a way, in a different dimension of perception, which unfolds different behaviors and etc., other people aren't necessarily there too. But we may be able to share a little bit. And this is our main capacity, is our ability to see differently, take different perspectives, see something different in the same moment. So walking down a trail, we might spot something really fascinating that other people might walk by. Not all the time, but that creative perceptual state increases the possibility that we're going to see new things, because it's an algorithm that is designed for us to see new moment to moment. And that does change behavior. So we epigesture ourselves further and further away from the reality where people are in the knowledge domain of repetition. For me, perception becomes an unlimited creative act. So the creative act is at the level of perception, not necessarily trying to create something in actuality so much. We think of creativity as painting or something, but it's a creative perception that is real creativity, because once we have that creative perception in the moment, that will change our field of possibilities for further creative perceptions. And there's another article I want to talk about that talks about the salience network. So having a new creative perception increases the salience of seeing the next logical step of that creative perception. Maybe not the next moment, but when it's around in actuality, it gives us the possibility of the next creative perception, which presents a discovery to our awareness. And then we can make our own discoveries with our own eyes. And that's why I've talked about the process of being a scientist as opposed to a scientist. Just looking at something and being able to understand it and discover that for oneself. And not necessarily thinking, I'm going to spend the next 20 years becoming a scientist so I can isolate this one variable to learn this one thing that I could learn in 1 second by looking. And of course we need science for certain things, for sure, but a lot of it we can discover for ourselves with our own eyes, and then have the field of science where it's absolutely necessary. So our ability to see differently is our most valuable asset. Yet at the same time, this is what we're punished for the most. Because if we start talking about what we're seeing differently, people, and they don't see it that way. They don't see creatively. They see according to their knowledge. And then if we're speaking as our creative perception, as that voice, and no longer speaking as the ego infusing past knowledge into the information of every moment and speaking as the ego self that everyone knows us as, then people are wondering what is wrong with us, when really something has shifted to become right with us. Creative perception can right a lot of the ego structures, but from the limited perspective of the ego, it seems threatening, and it seems like something's wrong with the person who's having creative perceptions. And I'm not saying that it never goes awry. It does, for sure. And I'm not here to talk about that as much because there's a million campaigns out there and so much information on that aspect. I'm here to talk about the other side of it and move into that, because there's so much talk about all the downsides, and 99% of people, or I don't know what percentage of people, are living mostly in the downside, because that's what we're discovering, and that's what we're focusing on, that's what we're talking about. And then that's how people who get labeled start to think about themselves and frame themselves, and that's the knowledge that they infuse into their perception. So if they have a creative perception, then all of a sudden the knowledge comes in and says, oh my gosh, that means something's wrong with me. That means, and so we never learn about what this process is doing. So there's another energy that infuses meaning into perception, infuses meaning into the information of the moment. And that is a different language altogether. And that's why I've talked with myself so much, because I feel like even the process of self-dialogue is a different language. Even if I was using all the same language, it's still a different language. It's a different approach to communication. And language is a part of communication, but it's not all of it. Yet, communication itself is a language. So there's body language, there's word language. But self-dialogue is a type of language of self-discovery. So it's more fundamental in a way. It uses the word language, it uses body language, but it's something more fundamental. Part of why I talk so much to myself is so maybe one day people won't be punished for seeing differently. Because here is Bo Lotto, an obvious genius neuroscientist doing all these great things and saying seeing differently is so important, yet don't see too differently. He doesn't say that part, but people like me who have been labeled and pathologized and medicated and numbed out and put through this rigmarole to get back into an ego self of certainty know that seeing differently is dangerous. More so because of the fallout of it all than actually the process of seeing differently. So how can we see differently and avoid the fallout? And part of that, I feel, is getting together and creating context together and learning this language together of seeing differently, and then not being pathologized for it. And part of that is seeing what seeing differently can do when it doesn't result in the fallout. And part of one of the downfalls is that we accidentally utilize the seeing differently to fuel more energy into the self, the ego. And then when that comes back online, it really does with a vengeance. More from bolotto.com/about. And I'm finding this really important and helpful to extrapolate, because it's one thing for me to babble on to myself for an entire year. And perhaps this is why at the end of the year, it could be important to find some relevant people who are doing some kind of science and see that they're saying exactly what I've discovered for myself. So it adds a confirmation of this process of self-discovery. And I've talked about to myself how it's not necessarily that self-dialogue is the only process. There are many, I'm sure. This is the one that I've found that resonates with me. Some people journal, some people talk to people, whatever. It's the discovery that's important, not what is discovered or the process per se. And again, I'll mention how he said that there's an ability to share and adapt knowledge to your own social and personal context. And that's what I've been doing with myself this entire year. And he's saying that leads to resilience. And he says it's only through discovery that we embody the understanding that leads to resilience. And this is the third time I've said that or more, because I feel like discovery also leads to the next discovery, and it also leads to manifestation, in that the nervous system is then primed to encounter one's discovery in reality. And that is a confirmation of the discovery in a way. Not necessarily the truth of the discovery ultimately, but the truth that what we discover or what meanings we make are what we will encounter as our life. So it's important to make meaning and make context and not accept unthinkingly all the information that we've been given or the ways that we've been told to translate the information or make meaning out of it. Because then we will continue to encounter our life as that. If we haven't experienced, all the meanings that we've been given will come in to translate that. So if I feel like any perception outside my limited sphere of perception is something to do with a mental illness, then as soon as I have that other perception, the knowledge of this could be a sign of mental illness or worsening mental illness comes in. Then that leads to the behavior of taking a PRN or going to the doctor for a med change or going for more PRNs or something. And we're not actually learning anything. So by accepting the meanings that we've been given, it creates the behaviors that continue this paradigm. And so it seems like us accepting those meanings of what perceiving outside the range of acceptable perception is, if we perceive outside of that, then it means that we're somehow mentally defective and we should seek medical help. And I'm not saying don't do that. It seems that that's inevitable for a lot of people, but we can also learn and move ourselves out of the process just as we somehow seem to move into that paradigm. We can move ourselves out of that paradigm, but not by accepting all those meanings without thinking. And he says to adapt knowledge to your own social and personal context. He's saying that as a neuroscientist, yet the mental health paradigm would say, don't think about it in any other way than we've told you to. Don't adapt anything to your own personal and social context. We're going to tell you how to think about this and how to adapt and manage your life in the future, given this whole context of the paradigm that we're telling you is a fact. And I question that. We can make sense of the meanings that we've experienced in some of these altered states. Not ultimately, but we can wonder and be curious and it could be that a lot of these meanings are ultimately meaningless objectively. But what is objective? Our lives aren't objective, they're subjective. So to me, this creating a large amount of context of meaning for oneself is acknowledging that we can make meaning for ourselves, we can discover for ourselves subjectively, and that's what the brain invited us into through the state of map consciousness. So it is saying yes to what the brain was initiated into and saying no more and more as time goes along. As we create more meaning and context for ourselves, we can say no over time to the meanings and information we've been given by the mental health system. We can crowd all of that out through our own process of discovery. It's similar to how when we grow up as children, we're very conditioned by our family and education. And then as adults, we move away from our family, and then we start to realize that a lot of the things that we thought were true and reality we got from our parents, but they're not ultimately true. But they conditioned our subjectivity. So in the same way, when we first get a mental illness label, we might really believe everything that we've been told. But then if we go through a process of discovery, we might be able to drop some of what we've been told in favor for our own discoveries later on in life as our life unfolds. And Bo Lotto says seeing differently is part of creativity, and I've talked a bit about that, how seeing differently, seeing something new, having new meaning or new context infuse into the moment of a perception to create perception is the very creative act. And that process in turn will lead to creative behaviors and over time change one's epigenetic matrix and unfold a completely different life, and perhaps unfold a life closer to one's original light body trajectory. And he says seeing differently is essential to succeeding in all aspects of contemporary society. So he says that, and we see differently. So to me, we are contemporaries. We are contemporary seers. We're seeing we are the contemporary society when we are that creative. And anyone who's been in that state feels like it is another world, completely another world. And it's challenging to learn to walk between both worlds, or to understand when we're in one world and when we're in the other. When we're in the world of creative perception and what that leads to, and when we're in the world of ego functioning and past knowledge and what that leads to. So if seeing differently is so important in a contemporary society, we as people who see very differently a lot of the time perhaps could inquire into how to refine this seeing differently. It's one thing to see differently, but it's another to speak differently. It's another to behave differently. So when I first went into map consciousness 6 years ago, I was seeing differently, I was speaking differently, I was behaving differently, and eventually it all bottomed out and I ended up in a so-called psychosis, and then I ended up in the hospital. And I feel like this process of self-dialogue has been a way for me to engage the seeing differently with myself. So I haven't felt the urge to talk to people about this because I'm talking about it with myself. I'm talking about my seeing differently, my creative perceptions with myself. So that energy is doing something. It's doing what it wants to do. It does want to be shared. It does want to be talked about. But the self-dialogue process is a process of acknowledging that other people aren't necessarily there. They're not necessarily going to see what I'm saying, see what I'm talking about, care what I'm talking about. And me talking with myself is also acknowledging that I know people don't care. They're busy, concerned about other things like what's on Netflix or the baseball game, and no judgment towards that. I can still enjoy those things too. But I like to talk about creative perceptions, but that's not really part of daily life. So I make it a part of my daily life through self-dialogue. So what I'm saying with that is that it seems like then I don't have the urge or impulse to reach out with my creative perceptions and then perhaps get a little jolt when it's not met with the same enthusiasm as I feel about the creative perception. And then that is part of what leads to some of the dissipation of energy, is when one shares and they're not able to see at that point in time what one is saying, then it can actually perhaps lead to one losing energy. So if all along I just attempted to say this to other people and they just walk away from me, eventually I'm just going to feel like I shouldn't talk about it anymore. But if I keep talking about it with myself, I'm never going to judge myself or stop myself from talking. So then it can just keep going on and it doesn't lose energy. And then the other thing too is it doesn't lead to as many behaviors that might be a desperation to share the creative perception. So if I go about trying to talk to people and I'm not actually trying in that space, at least the very first time, it's just what's happening. But through that happening, I've learned that it's not good to just wander around in the world and share creative perceptions. It would be like attempting to share a creative perception with person A, person B, person C, person D, nothing happens. And then it just sort of wears out after a while, versus just sharing it with myself and it doesn't wear out in the same way. Because even if it didn't wear out on person A, B, C, D, I've just shared little bits with 100 people versus all the bits in one go with myself. And not losing energy and momentum of that dialogue with myself. But I have had dialogues with other people where it's really fulfilling and we discover something deep. And the interesting thing is when that happens, I don't have the urge to write anything down. I don't remember anything we said. It's just innately fulfilling in itself. And I'm not like, oh, I got to remember this for later to talk about myself in self-dialogue. It's just gone. It's just nothing. It was just a creative dialogue where we're creatively perceiving something and then it's let go of. So I feel like if this were the way, if this was the way, I don't know, that we were in daily life, then I wouldn't necessarily have to dialogue with myself to keep the dialogical area of my brain going. Because I can just keep it going with myself. And if I try to have dialogue with someone out there who doesn't dialogue, then it's going to be like talking to a wall. So in saying all that, we need to question our seeing. And I've talked a lot about this with myself, how I don't believe anything I say. And at first I did that very first time, but now I don't cling on to anything that I say, because as soon as I do, I'm going to remember it and then store it for later and project it as a pattern to follow. And that's what we do in the ego consciousness process, but it's so limited that it only gets us into a relative amount of trouble. And it doesn't really get us in trouble because we're just projecting the same thing and moving in the same loops all the time. So we're moving in our certainty. But when we're moving in uncertainty and then we try to make certain things certain, and then project that and move in that as if it's certain, we forget we're moving in uncertainty. We need to doubt everything that we feel is certain. Because the thing is, it might be certain only in that moment, only in that context, only in that place and time. So to cling onto it and save it for later is a mistake. It is the self that clings on and feels like this will be useful for later. So then he goes on to explain some of the lab days that he has, and they sound kind of cool. He said there are participatory experiments, and to me, the state of map consciousness, using what he just said as a primer to extrapolate more meaning and understanding of my own, to my own context, the whole experience of map consciousness is a participatory experience. It's participating directly with the universe, not being a spectator and not being a projector and moving in the field of one's own projections based on past knowledge. It's dropping all the knowledge and participating directly in the moment. And in that way, we learn in an embodied way. So that learning is still part of our blueprint. And that's why I feel like epigenetics and harvesting one's mania and practicing and embodying the lessons of those participatory experiments as in those states. So most of the time we might be in our ego consciousness, but we have this experimental time in altered states that we go into non-volitionally, where we get to move and experience ourselves in different ways. It's like an experiment, and then we learn something, and then we're back in the usual consciousness, but we can still take what we learned from that experiment, from those altered states, and apply it to our life. Just like we might if we are in some kind of participatory experiment designed by some person like Bolotto. We'll take those lessons and apply it to our life. And he says we've learned it in an embodied way and we've discovered. That's what happens in map consciousness. We're embodied. We're learning in an embodied way. We discover. And then we are back after the fallout in some semblance of our ego self. But we can still take the lesson of those experimental states. It's like the universe gave us an experimental consciousness where we can experiment and try new things and be new things and have new ways of being and moving and behaving and gesturing and speaking and seeing and doing. So why aren't we applying some of those lessons? Why are we just trying to recover back to the self algorithm? And he says, we will discover together and thus embody the knowledge we've discovered. And I'd like to extrapolate that to my own context in that in my altered state experiences, I've discovered certain things. And I've talked about a lot of things. And by talking about what I discovered in those states, I'm discovering new things in real time. And I wonder if there are others like me who have discoveries to share, and then can we share some discoveries together and have dialogue together, and then in that way amplify the unfolding of the context from being me with my personal context that keeps me somewhat safe from the mental health system and moving in my own discoveries and meaning making to sharing that with each other. And then can we build a whole language and context together? And then once we have that understanding and meaning, can we move from that point discovering based on the embodied lessons that we have learned? And what will that unfold as our life? So it's one thing to share context in order to say, keep us safe from the memes of mental health and psychiatry, or move us away from them and bathe more in our own understanding than in the limited understanding of medical pathology. So that's the safety element. And it's not even safety as in wanting to be certain, but it's, can we move into the field of uncertainty without others saying that we're defective and deficient and deteriorating and all of these things that they say? The self is deteriorating for sure, but there are new elements of functioning coming on. And if anyone's gone into map consciousness, you know how fast we learn. So we can learn new algorithms of functioning that might be way beyond what society now calls functioning. It could be something contemporary. And I was listening to a talk, I think it was by Bolotto, and he said in 2014, I can't remember the years, but it was something like 5 years, a 5-year span where the top jobs in 5 years later weren't even invented 5 years earlier. So I feel like our brains are operating in this space, this dimension of creating something that doesn't even exist yet. Ways of being, even jobs, even functions in society. So our brain is for a different function in society, and it's up to us to figure that out. Otherwise, we'll be categorized as dysfunctional. So this is really important. So in some cultures, if somebody goes into this kind of extreme state, distress, crisis, they recognize that this person needs some kind of shamanic training. And there are people to help. So what is it that we can step into? What is our function? Can we discover that? We haven't discovered it yet. Can we discover it and create it for ourselves through our own creative perceptions and discoveries, embodied learning? The people that pathologize us are not going to do that for us. And then he says, you will have a renewed sense of wonder, motivation, and understanding that are the essential tools to see differently. Though whether in a corporate, educational, or governmental context, seeing differently is ultimately a personal choice. And what I have to say about that is it's not always a personal choice. When people are thrust into map consciousness, we don't personally choose to go there and see differently. So written from the perspective of somebody who's never gone into altered states non-volitionally, it seems like it's a personal choice. But for us as a neurotribe, where our main potential is seeing differently, non-volitionally, not because we tried to a lot of the time, we don't necessarily have a personal choice to turn off this seeing differently, but we can discover and learn what this seeing differently is attempting to unfold. And can we get with that unfolding? Can we move with that unfolding? As we learn to walk by walking, can we learn to perceive creatively by perceiving creatively? And can we do that together? And it says, Bo Lotto pioneers understanding of perception and applies it to create transformational experiences. And I would say the universe can do that too. The universe knows more about perception than we do, and it can utilize its algorithms to create transformational experiences for us too. So that's what happens in map consciousness. There is an energy that can transform our perception, and it has nothing to do with the self algorithm. So anything we do through the volition of the self algorithm isn't necessarily going to be that. It might create a tiny little version of that as a simulator, because the ego can simulate and project a lot of things. So if we gain enough knowledge about what transformation is or creative perception, the ego might be able to project that and make us feel like we're experiencing that, but it still might not even really be that. It's just gaining enough knowledge about it to have a small experience of that. And then what the ego makes important is that we had that experience, but not seeing and moving in that process of discovery itself. It makes it feel like the ego discovered something and it had an experience and now it's going to try and get it again, which is what it always does with everything. It says, whoa, this was pleasurable, I'm going to try and get it again. And then it's just moving in its own projection, which then prevents one from stepping into the actuality of moving in uncertainty and discovery. Because the ego would be very certain that it was in uncertainty, and it's going to certainly look for uncertainty. And he says, the fuel for innovation is seeing differently and thinking differently. And I would say we who go into map consciousness have many experiences of seeing and thinking differently. And if this is related to innovation, well then I would say that we need to learn how to utilize our seeing and thinking differently innately for innovation. We are innovative consciousness itself, yet we haven't discovered unfolding as innovation. And that's why I feel like if we create a really large bank of our insights and our ideas and our innovations, that it could be really powerful, because we've gone into that innovative consciousness, but we can't necessarily create all of our innovations. It's impossible. But we've definitely seen a lot of ideas around those innovations. So if we collect all of those, we might have a huge bank of innovations and ideas that really could change the world. And interestingly enough, in that state, often we feel like we have to change the world, or we're going to change the world. And it could be that we get in touch with that consciousness of innovation, that we need other innovative minds and to collaborate and co-create in order to bring these innovations about. And I feel like by sharing our ideas and innovations, that will get the energy moving and flowing. And that's what that energy is trying to do. So if we are getting with that doing, then the doing is functioning as it is wanting to function, and we won't as often have our nervous systems totally blown out by this process. And Bo says we need to ask good questions. And in the state of map consciousness, we're questioning every moment without even asking a question. The very nature of our eyes are a question, not full of knowledge. And so that's how we're in this place of discovery, that our eyes are just questioning everything by looking at them without having to think about a question. So that's a different space where our eyes are looking as a question, as questioning everything, versus looking and thinking of a question. So again, the ego looking and thinking of a question is a simulation. It is a virtual process compared to the process of having questions in one's eyes, the state of questioning, not making questions, but looking from not knowing. I don't know if that makes any sense. So, yeah, that was my extrapolation. No copyright infringement intended. What I am doing is extrapolating to my own personal context, and it's so important to do, I feel, right now, because there's so much out there in terms of memes of how defective we are and how we're going to deteriorate and we're non-functional, and there's a lot going on in the world of neuroplasticity and neuroscience that resonates so much with what I've experienced as some of the potentials and capacities of the brain, as I have a human brain. Yet it's not being extrapolated to non-volitional experiences of altered states of consciousness that are then interpreted as the person is mentally ill. The self is mentally ill. And what I want to talk about next is there is no self to be mentally ill. So to do all this work around getting that self back intact is moving in the wrong direction. And so extrapolating what others are saying in the forefront of science right now is so important for people in the neuro tribe of being trans-conscious or having access to other domains of consciousness. And we haven't discovered how to integrate that, what our function is in this world. And maybe we can discover that together in an embodied way. And the last thing he says that I want to talk about is good questions stimulate creativity and create compelling new narratives for our brains to adopt in order to think and behave differently. And I would say the questioning state, the state of map consciousness where the very approach we take is to question, not a particular question that the mind formulates, but to have questioning eyes definitely creates new narratives, and we get lost in those narratives sometimes. And I would say not to get attached to a particular narrative, but to see how looking with questions will allow the universe to whisper subtle meanings that we may mistakenly translate into something to do with ourself or our ego, when really it has nothing to do with ourself. It's the process of discovery which is negating the self. So hopefully not making more of a self out of this creative perception which has nothing to do with the self. I would say the compelling new narrative for me is that all of these wonderful scientific discoveries related to flow and creativity and thinking differently and neuroplasticity and everything extrapolates and translates to people who have been labeled with mental illnesses. But people who go into those states non-volitionally, it's a big jump as opposed to what we're usually comfortable with these little incremental steps of slowly learning over time. But there is other processes than the way the ego goes about feeling like it's learning something and changing. The universe can do it much more powerfully. This other energy that is a different algorithm, a different operating system of a human being that is not the self. We take the self to be the ultimate, but it's not. And so I would like to say that narrative is not about any of the narratives that we personally come up with when we're in those altered states, but the narrative is that the brain is undergoing a mutation, a neuroplastic change, a transformation that suspends the self and breaks it down. And can we understand that energy? Can we see what the self is doing and see what the energy is doing? And can we question all of it? So the main narrative is we're not defective, but it's up to us to discover how we can be effective and how we might function in this world, because nobody else is going to tell us that. We have to see it for ourselves. Just like in that state, we've seen many things for ourselves. Yeah, I have no idea what I'm talking about.